The corporate tower's lobby had already been transformed into something from a winter dream by the time Henry Calder pushed through the service entrance that Christmas Eve. White lights cascaded down marble pillars in frozen rivers of brilliance, each bulb perfectly placed to catch the eye without overwhelming the senses. The scent of fresh pine mingled with cinnamon and something sweeter vanilla maybe, or burnt sugar from the catering station, where servers in crisp black uniforms arranged trays of delicate pastries. Employees clustered in small groups throughout the vast space, their champagne flutes catching light like tiny stars, their laughter echoing off polished floors that reflected the massive tree standing sentinel near the executive elevators. Henry moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned long ago how to occupy space without claiming it. His gray work shirt bore the faded logo of Whitmore Holdings Maintenance, the fabric thin from countless washes, the collar frayed at the edges. Dark stains marked his sleeves where he'd wrestled with a heating vent on the third floor earlier that afternoon, grease stubbornly clinging despite his best efforts with industrial soap. His hands, broad and calloused, still carried traces of oil beneath the nails, evidence of the kind of work that left permanent marks. At 36, he carried himself with a quietness that most people mistook for resignation, never guessing at the careful discipline and it took to move through the world this way, to make himself small enough that others wouldn't look too closely. They saw the janitor, the man who fixed what broke, who cleaned what spilled, who existed in the margins of their glossy lives. They never saw the artist whose fingers had once danced across concert hall stages with a precision that made critics reach for words like transcendent and revelatory. They never saw the name that had appeared in regional papers for 3 brief shining months before the accident tore everything apart. They never saw the ghost of the boy who'd believed music could save him. Audrey clung to his hand with the fierce grip of a 7-year-old navigating unfamiliar territory. Her dark curls, so much like her mother's, had been bounced with each step as she pressed closer to his side. Those brown eyes, wide with wonder, took in everything at once, the chocolate fountain on the dessert table, sending rivers of sweetness cascading over strawberries and marshmallows, the ice sculptures melting slowly in their designated alcoves, the women in dresses that probably cost more than his monthly rent. She wore her best outfit, a navy blue dress with white trim that he'd found at the thrift store 2 weeks ago, carefully mended where the hem had started to unravel. Her shoes were too big, bought with room to grow, but she'd stuffed tissue in the toes and refused to complain. Henry watched her face light up as she spotted the dessert table, and something in his chest tightened in with the particular ache of loving someone so much it became a physical presence in his body. Fierce and protective and edged with guilt that never quite faded, no matter how many extra shifts he picked up or how carefully he budgeted every dollar. He couldn't give her the childhood she deserved, the one with ballet classes and summer camps and toys that weren't secondhand. What he could give her was this, a night of magic in a world that would never truly be theirs, a memory she might carry into adulthood when the cramped apartment and clanking radiator had faded into forgetting. "Daddy, can we get chocolate?" The words tumbled out in a rush of excitement, her small hand tugging at his with insistent hope. The fountain sprayed in perfect arcs, coating fruit in dark silk. He nodded, unable to deny her anything, when she looked at him like that, and they made their way through the crowd toward the promise of sweetness. Across the hall, elevated on the mezzanine level that overlooked the lobby like a throne room surveying its kingdom, Ingrid Whitmore stood with the practiced poise of someone born to command spaces exactly like this one. At 34, she had transformed her father's struggling real estate firm into an empire that now controlled 40% of the city's waterfront, an achievement that had earned her profiles in business magazines and invitations to speak at conferences where powerful men twice her age hung on her words. Her honey blonde hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, the kind of effortless elegance that required a team of stylists and products most people couldn't pronounce. The crimson dress she wore demanded attention without apology, a bold V-neck that showcased collarbones sharp enough to cut glass fabric that hugged curves with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what weapons she carried and how to deploy them. But it was her eyes that truly arrested people when they met her gaze. Ice blue and calculating, they seemed to measure every person, every angle, every potential weakness or opening. She could read a room in seconds, identify who held real power versus who merely performed. It determined which battles were worth fighting and which were better left to subordinate wars. Most found her intimidating, Some whispered ruthless behind cupped hands at charity galas. No one, not even her closest advisors, would ever dare call her soft. Yet beneath the armor of designer labels and cutting boardroom reputation, beneath the quarterly reports and acquisition strategies, Ingrid carried a wound that had never fully healed. Time had scabbed it, overbuilt scar tissue thick enough that she could function, could lead meetings and negotiate contracts and smile at the appropriate moments. But it remained there, buried deep, a hollow space where something vital had been carved out and never replaced. 16 years ago, when she was 18 and still believed the world rewarded goodness with happy endings, she had fallen in love with a boy named Leon Merritt. He was a piano prodigy, all wild dark hair and passionate eyes that burned with the kind of intensity that made you forget to breathe when he looked at you. The kind of talent that transcended mere technical skill, that reached into something primal and true and dragged it screaming into the light. He'd played for her the first night they met at that summer music camp, his fingers moving across keys like he was pulling confession from the instrument itself, and Ingrid had felt something in her chest crack open, some door she hadn't known was locked, swinging wide. He wrote her a song just for her. He called it Starlit Promise, and he played it for her one night. Under a sky so full of stars, it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet, the two of them sitting on the dock at the lake while the rest of the camp slept. The melody had started gentle, almost hesitant, before building into something that made her throat tight and her eyes burn. When he finished, his hands still resting on the portable keyboard he'd lugged down to the water's edge, he'd turned to her with a vulnerability that made him look younger than 17. "That's everything I feel but can't say." His voice had been barely above a whisper, almost lost in the sound of water lapping against wooden posts. "Everything I want to promise you, but don't have words for." 3 weeks later, Leon died on a rain-slicked highway when his mother's car hydroplaned and wrapped itself around a telephone pole. The impact had been instantaneous, the police told his parents. He wouldn't have felt anything, as if that mattered, as if the speed of death made the absence less absolute. The song died with him, or so Ingrid had believed for 16 years. She never heard it played again, never sought out recordings, or asked other students from that summer if they remembered Leon's compositions. She forbade herself from listening to music the way she once had, treating it, instead, as background noise at restaurants or elevators, something to fill silence without demanding feeling. Because if she let herself sink into melody the way she had that night on the dock, if she allowed music to reach past her defenses and touch the raw places inside, the grief would swallow her whole. Better to build walls, better to focus on things she could control, profit margins and development deals, and the satisfaction of watching her company's stock price climb. Better to accept her father's choice of husband, a man who spoke her language of returns on investment and strategic partnerships, who would never ask her to feel more than was professionally useful. A child's bright voice cut through Ingrid's careful inventory of the evening's attendees, pulling her attention down to the lobby floor. The little girl with wild curls had somehow wandered away from the maintenance worker and now stood near the dessert table, reaching for a chocolate-covered strawberry positioned just beyond her grasp. She stretched on tiptoes, her small body extending with the absolute determination only children possess, certain that wanting something badly enough could bridge the gap between fingertips and prize. The champagne spill happened too fast to prevent. Some careless guest had set down their glass too close to the edge of the table, and when Audrey's elbow brushed against the stem, liquid sloshed out onto the polished marble in a small, dangerous puddle. Her foot hit the wet spot at the exact wrong angle, physics and bad luck conspiring, and suddenly she was falling, her small body tilting sideways with nothing to catch her. The sound of her knee cracking against marble was small but sharp, the kind of noise that cuts through ambient chatter and makes everyone in a 10-foot radius turn to look. Immediately, Audrey's face crumpled that moment before the pain fully registers, when a child's expression shifts from surprise to dawning horror. Blood seeped through her white tights, a dark stain spreading from the tear in the fabric where skin had met unforgiving stone. Henry was across the room in seconds, moving with a speed that belied his careful invisibility. He dropped to his knees beside his daughter, his broad hands gentle as he assessed the damage. From his pocket, he pulled a clean white handkerchief, kind no one carried anymore, except men who'd learned to be prepared for disasters, both small and large. He pressed it to her scraped knee with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd bandaged countless playground injuries, late-night stumbles, the small catastrophes of raising a child alone. His voice when he spoke was low and soothing, carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around Audrey like a blanket. "Hey, sweetheart, you're okay. I've got you. Just a little scrape. Nothing we can't fix." Audrey's sobs quieted to hiccups as he held her, his broad hand cradling the back of her head, his body creating a shelter from the stares of strangers who'd paused their conversations to witness the small drama unfolding on their marble floor. She buried her face against his shoulder, her small fingers clutching at the cheap fabric of his work shirt, and Henry found himself wishing not for the first time that he could protect her from every hurt, every disappointment, every moment when the world revealed its capacity for casual cruelty. But before he could lift her to carry her somewhere private where he could properly clean the wound, a man's voice sliced through the moment with the precision of a scalpel. "Can you control your child?" Flynn Baker strode over with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having to question his right to occupy space. His tailored navy suit fit like it had been constructed specifically for his frame, which it had by a tailor in Manhattan who charged more for alterations than Henry made in a month. Every line was perfect, every detail calculated to project success and authority. His chestnut hair had been styled with product that caught the light just so, and his smile wide and bright and utterly devoid of warmth never quite reached his eyes. He worked in private equity, spoke frequently about optimizing assets, and maximizing shareholder value in a tone that made it clear he viewed most things, including people, as items on a spreadsheet requiring evaluation. He was Ingrid's fiancé, or rather the man her father had chosen for her to marry in 6 weeks. The wedding was already planned, the venue booked, the invitations printed on heavy cardstock that announced the merger of two powerful families with all the romance of a corporate prospectus. Flynn gestured at the small smear of blood on the pristine marble floor, with the kind of theatrical disgust usually reserved for finding vermin in a five-star restaurant. "This is a corporate event, not a daycare. If you can't afford a babysitter, maybe you shouldn't have brought her." The words landed like blows, each one carefully chosen to wound. Henry's jaw tightened, every muscle in his body going rigid with the effort of restraining the anger that surged hot and immediate through his veins. But he kept his voice level, kept his tone respectful, because he'd learned long ago that men like him didn't get to express rage, didn't get to push back against insults from men like Flynn Baker without consequences that rippled far beyond the moment. "She's 7. She slipped. It was an accident." Flynn's eyes raked over Henry's work clothes with undisguised contempt, taking in every stain, every frayed edge, every visible marker of poverty and manual labor. "An accident that wouldn't have happened if you knew your place. Your maintenance. There's a staff entrance for a reason. Maybe next time you'll use it instead of pretending you belong here." Audrey's bottom lip trembled, and something in Henry's chest cracked wider. This was the world he tried to shield her from, the casual cruelty of people who measured worth in bank accounts and job titles, who could look at a bleeding child and see only an inconvenience to be removed. He opened his mouth to respond, words forming that he knew he'd regret but couldn't quite suppress, when another voice cut through the tension. Ingrid Whitmore descended the mezzanine stairs with deliberate grace, each step measured and purposeful, her heels clicking against marble in a rhythm that commanded attention. The conversations around them stuttered and died as people turned to watch, sensing drama of a different magnitude unfolding. When she reached the small tableau, her ice-blue eyes fixed on Flynn with a coldness that could frost windows, and Henry felt the temperature in the immediate vicinity drop several degrees. "You don't have the authority to speak to my employees that way." Her voice came out quiet, barely above conversational volume, but it carried the kind of power that made people lean in to catch every word. The room had gone silent, everyone watching. "Apologize." Flynn's face flushed red, creeping up from his collar to stain his carefully maintained complexion. "Ingrid, I was just apologize." She repeated the word like it was a command to a subordinate, allowing no room for negotiation or excuse. "Now." For a moment, Flynn's expression twisted with something ugly, pride and anger and humiliation warring for dominance. But he must have recognized that this was a battle he couldn't win, not here, not with everyone watching. His lips pressed and into a thin line before he managed a clipped response directed more at the floor than at Henry or Audrey. "Sorry." The word carried all the sincerity of a hostage reading from a script, but Ingrid seemed to accept it as sufficient. She turned to Henry then, and for just a moment, her expression softened in a way that transformed her face completely. The Ice Queen melted just enough to reveal something human underneath, something that recognized the protective fury barely restrained in his shoulders, the careful way he held his daughter, like she was made of glass. Take care of your daughter. Her tone had shifted to something gentle, almost tender. The first aid kit is in the executive lounge. 5th floor. Take the private elevator. She gestured toward the brass doors behind her personal desk area access that was normally restricted to C-suite executives and their invited guests. Henry knotted his throat too tight for words of gratitude that would have felt inadequate anyway. He stood carefully cradling Audrey against his chest, her arms wrapping around his neck as he carried her toward the indicated elevator. She felt impossibly light in his arms, his little girl who was growing too fast, who deserved so much more than second-hand dresses and chocolate fountain treats at her father's work party. The executive lounge was nothing like the break room where Henry normally ate his lunch. Soft leather couches faced floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city spreading out below, like a carpet of lights. A fully stocked kitchen occupied one corner, all stainless steel and granite surfaces. The first aid kit, when he found it in a cabinet marked with a red cross, was comprehensive enough to stock a small clinic. He worked quickly but gently, cleaning the scrape with antiseptic wipes that made Audrey hiss and bury her face against his shoulder again. It's okay, baby. Almost done. You're being so brave. The adhesive bandage he applied featured cartoon characters she was probably too old to appreciate, but she studied them seriously while he worked, her tears finally stopping. An executive assistant appeared after a few minutes, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Patricia and said Ms. Whitmore had sent her to check on them. She returned moments later with hot chocolate in a proper mug, not the paper cups from the lobby station topped with real whipped cream and a candy cane for stirring. She brought a plate of cookies too, the fancy kind with icing and sprinkles, that Audrey's eyes went wide seeing. You take your time, Patricia told Henry with the warmth that suggested she was a mother herself, that she recognized the particular exhaustion in his eyes. There's no rush. The party will go on for hours. By the time they returned to the lobby an hour later, Audrey's spirits had been restored by sugar and kindness. Her knee properly bandaged, the tears forgotten in the way children could sometimes simply release pain and move forward. The party had grown louder in their absence, inhibitions loosening as champagne flowed, and the evening settled into that comfortable chaos of people who worked together but rarely socialized, discovering they might actually like each other outside office hours. Someone had opened the piano, a vintage Steinway that usually sat covered in the corner, more decorative than functional. It occupied a small, raised platform near the eastern windows, positioned to catch natural light during the day, but now illuminated by carefully placed spotlights that made the polished black surface gleam. A few employees had gathered around it, laughing and making requests from a tipsy accountant who knew maybe 3 chords and played them with more enthusiasm than skill. The resulting music was cheerful in its awfulness, people clapping along anyway because the point wasn't artistry, but participation. Audrey tugged at Henry's hand, her face tilted up to his with an expression he recognized too well. The look that said she was about to ask for something she knew might be difficult, but her 7-year-old optimism insisted it was worth trying anyway. Daddy, can you play, please, just one song so I can sleep? Henry hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to refuse to make an excuse to slip away before anyone connected him with the instrument currently producing those enthusiastic but painful sounds. He hadn't played publicly in years, not since before the accident, before everything fell apart. God, the accident had shattered more than the bones in his right hand. It had broken something in his soul, made him afraid to touch keys in front of anyone who might judge, who might remember what he used to be and see only what he'd become. But Audrey's eyes were so hopeful, brown and earnest and full of a faith in him that felt both precious and terrifying. It was Christmas Eve, and she'd been so brave about her scraped knee, hadn't complained when Flynn made her feel small, had smiled through hot chocolate, even though he knew she understood on some level that they were different from everyone else here, that they were guests in a world that would never truly welcome them. How could he say no? The accountant relinquished the piano bench with good-natured relief, stumbling away to rejoin friends near the bar. Henry sat down slowly, the bench's height familiar in a way that made his chest ache with muscle memory, older than thought. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, trembling slightly, fear and longing tangled so tightly he couldn't separate them. The crowd quieted as curiosity replaced chatter. The maintenance guy was going to play. This should be interesting, probably in the way minor disasters were interesting, something to laugh about later. Then Henry began. The melody that filled the hall was unlike anything most of them had ever heard. It started gentle, barely more than a whisper, single notes placed with such precision and care that each one felt weighted with meaning. Like rain on glass, or the first hesitant conversation between strangers who sensed they might become something more. The pattern repeated developed, each iteration adding layers of complexity while maintaining that initial tenderness. Then it grew, swelled into something achingly beautiful, a cascade of sound that spoke of longing and loss and a love so deep it transcended language. Henry's eyes closed as he played his damaged right hand scarred from where the stage rigging had crushed it, 12 years ago, moving with a grace that defied its injury. 3 surgeries had left the skin webbed with silver lines, had fused bones that no longer flexed quite right, had stolen the speed and precision that professional performance demanded. But memory lived in muscles deeper than scars could reach. He played from the marrow of his bones, every note, a piece of his heart laid bare before strangers who would never know what they were witnessing. The melody climbed higher urgency, replacing gentleness, passion, breaking through restraint. His left hand provided foundation, steady and sure, while his right wove stories of what could have been, what almost was what died before it ever had the chance to fully bloom. The piece had a structure that revealed careful composition rather than improvisation. Someone had spent hours crafting these progressions, had understood how to build tension and release it, how to make silence as meaningful as sound. The middle section introduced a counter melody that spoke in dialogue with the main theme, 2 voices having a conversation without words, asking questions and offering answers that were themselves new questions. Audrey stood beside the piano, her face wrapped with wonder, the bandage on her knee forgotten. She'd heard her father play before late at night in their apartment when he thought she was sleeping, or at the community center down the street during off hours when no one else was around. But never like this. Never with this kind of abandon, this complete surrender to something larger than practicality or fear. Ingrid Whitmore had been preparing to leave when the music reached her. She'd been standing near the elevator, her coat already retrieved from the executive closet, ready to escape the party she'd hosted, but never truly joined. She froze mid-step, one hand gripping the brass railing of the mezzanine so hard her knuckles turned white. The melody wrapped around her like a ghost, insubstantial but undeniable, pulling her backward through 16 years to a summer night when stars seemed close enough to touch, and a boy with dark eyes had played this exact song for her. Every note matched her memory with the precision of a key fitting into a lock. The opening phrase so gentle, it was almost apologetic. The building intensity that made breathing difficult. The way certain passages seemed to ask questions while others offered comfort. Starlit Promise, Leon's song, Leon's gift. The last piece of him she had left buried so deep in her memory, she'd sometimes wondered if she'd invented its beauty, if grief had burnished it into something more perfect than reality could have produced. But she hadn't imagined it. The proof flooded the lobby now, every note confirming that the melody lived outside her grief, existed independent of her loss. Exactly as Leon had played it that night on the dock. Every pause, every aching phrase, every moment where the music seemed to hold its breath before plunging forward again. How? The question screamed through her mind even as her body refused to move, rooted to the mezzanine like she'd grown there. How could this stranger, this janitor who fixed toilets and changed light bulbs, know Leon's song? The song that had died with him, that existed in no recordings that Leon had played for her, alone in a moment so private it felt sacred. Around her, guests murmured appreciation, commenting on how surprisingly talented the maintenance guy was, how maybe he'd missed his calling, how nice it was to have real music instead of the accountant's enthusiastic butchering of holiday classics. Oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath Ingrid's feet had just shattered, that reality had cracked open to reveal something impossible. She descended the stairs on unsteady legs, drawn to the piano, as if magnetized, unable to resist. even though every instinct screamed that moving closer would only make the impossibility more undeniable. Her heels clicked against marble, but the sound felt distant, muffled, like she was moving through water. The music swelled around her, filling spaces in her chest she'd sealed off years ago, and she couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think past the melody that was simultaneously foreign and more familiar than her own heartbeat. Henry finished the song with a final phrase that resolved into something peaceful, acceptance rather than triumph. His hands lifted from the keys and hovered in the air for a moment before settling into his lap. He opened his eyes to find the CEO standing 3 feet away, her face pale as moonlight, those ice-blue eyes swimming with unshed tears that threatened to spill over. The silence after the music felt too heavy, like atmosphere before a thunderstorm. People started to clap, but the sound died quickly when they saw Ingrid's expression, recognized that something significant was happening, even if they couldn't understand what. "Where did you learn that?" Her voice came out raw, barely above a whisper, stripped of all the polish and authority she usually wielded like weapons. Henry stood slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs hard enough to hurt. He'd known this moment might come someday, had spent 12 years simultaneously dreading it and longing for it. Every time he played that song in the privacy of his apartment or the empty community center, he'd imagined this confrontation. Prepared speeches that evaporated now that she stood before him, real and devastated and demanding answers he wasn't ready to give. "It's just an old melody, something I picked up years ago." The lie tasted bitter, inadequate. But what else could he say? The truth was too complicated, too weighted with history and regret, and the particular shame of being invisible to someone who'd once meant everything. "Don't lie to me." Ingrid's voice sharpened, desperation creeping into her tone like cracks appearing in ice. "That song, it was written for me by someone who died 16 years ago. No one else knew it. No one could have known it." She stepped closer, searching his face for answers with an intensity that made him want to look away, to retreat into the safety of anonymity. But he held her gaze because he owed her that much, even if he couldn't give her the truth she was demanding. "Who are you?" Before Henry could formulate a response that wouldn't destroy everything, Audrey appeared at his side. She'd been examining the piano's internal mechanisms, fascinated by the hammers and strings. But now she wrapped herself around his leg with the casual possessiveness of a child who'd never learned to fear strangers. "That was beautiful, Daddy. Can we go home now? I'm sleepy." Ingrid's gaze dropped to the little girl, then back to Henry, and something in her expression shifted. She saw the fear in his eyes, the way he instinctively moved to shield his daughter from her intensity. She forced herself to breathe, to step back, to remember where she was. This was her company's party, surrounded by employees who would gossip about any strange behavior, and she was supposed to be celebrating their successful year, not interrogating the maintenance staff about impossible music. But as Henry gathered Audrey's coat from where he'd draped it over a nearby chair and hurried toward the exit, Ingrid stood rooted to the spot, the melody still echoing in her skull like a hymn or a curse. Her hands shook when she tried to smooth her dress, and she had to clasp them together to hide the trembling. Patricia appeared at her elbow with a glass of water that Ingrid accepted without tasting. "Are you all right, Ms. Whitmore? You look pale." "I'm fine, just tired." The automatic response, the one she'd perfected over years of pretending that nothing touched her, that she operated above the messiness of human emotion. "Tell Flynn I had to leave early. Emergency with the Anderson contract." She left through the executive exit before anyone else could approach her, before she had to maintain the facade for another second. Her driver waited with the car, and she slid into the back seat with the relief of someone escaping a crime scene. "Home." Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. The penthouse was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Minimalist furniture in shades of gray and white floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city she'd conquered, art on the walls that had been selected by a professional who assured her these pieces would appreciate in value. Nothing personal, nothing warm, nothing that revealed who she was beneath the CEO title and stock portfolio. She poured herself a glass of wine she didn't drink and stood at the window watching traffic crawl through streets below. Christmas lights blinked on buildings across the river, families gathering in apartments and houses to celebrate togetherness she'd never quite understood how to achieve. Her father was probably at his club, drinking scotch with other men who measured success in numbers that grew but never satisfied. Flynn was likely still at the party, networking and performing the kind of charm that came so easily to people who'd never had to question their worth. But all Ingrid could think about was the janitor's scarred hands moving across piano keys with a grace that defied damage, playing a song that should have been impossible for him to know. She didn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Leon's face as it had been that last summer, young and alive, and full of dreams about the music they'd make together. He talked about concert halls and recordings, about the way they'd tour Europe and Asia, performing compositions that would make people weep and laugh and remember what it meant to be human. She'd believed him because his certainty was infectious, because when you were 18 and in love, the future stretched out infinite and golden. Then she saw the janitor's face superimposed over Leon's, those gray-green eyes that held sorrow deeper than any manual labor could explain. The way he'd held his daughter like she was the only thing in the world worth protecting. The fear in his expression when Ingrid had demanded answers. Who was he, and how had he stolen a piece of her past? The next morning, Ingrid arrived at the office 2 hours before anyone else, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep, but her mind sharp with purpose. She went directly to HR and pulled Henry Calder's employee file herself, spreading the thin folder across her desk like evidence of a crime she was determined to solve. The information was sparse to the point of concerning. Hired 3 years ago as maintenance staff. No college degree listed. Previous employment at a warehouse in the industrial district. Before that, a grocery store. Before that, a series of odd jobs that painted a picture of someone drifting through whatever work they could find. Emergency contact. None listed except for Audrey Calder, age 7 daughter. Relationship status. Single. No mention of a wife, current or former. No indication of the child's mother or where she might be. The file said nothing about music. Nothing about training or talent or any history that would explain how a man who changed light bulbs and unclogged drains could play like that. His address was listed as an apartment building on the east side, the kind of neighborhood where sirens were background noise and rent came due before food budget was calculated. Ingrid picked up her phone and dialed her assistant before remembering that it was the day after Christmas, that most people weren't working, that the world outside her office operated on rhythms different from her constant need to solve problems and close loops. She tried Henry's employee contact number instead. It rang 4 times before going to a generic voicemail. She didn't leave a message. What would she say? This is your boss, the woman who watched you play an impossible song, demanding you explain how you know the melody. My dead first love wrote for me. Instead, she pulled up her archive contacts and scrolled back years until she found the name she was looking for. Corbin Hale. He'd been Leon's mentor, the one who'd recognized the boy's genius and nurtured it through adolescence, who got him the scholarship to that summer music camp, where Ingrid had fallen in love with both the musician and the man. She hadn't spoken to Corbin in over a decade. After Leon's death, she'd severed ties with anything connected to that summer, unable to bear the weight of shared grief. But now she needed answers that only someone from that time could provide. The phone rang longer than she expected, and Ingrid almost hung up before a familiar voice, older and rougher than she remembered, answered. Corbin Hale speaking. Ingrid's throat tightened unexpectedly. Mr. Hale. This is Ingrid Whitmore. I don't know if you remember me, but of course I remember you, Ingrid. The warmth in his tone was genuine, untainted by the awkwardness she'd anticipated. How could I forget Leon's girl? How are you? I need to talk to you about Leon, about one of his compositions. The words came out, rushed, desperate, in a way that made her wince. Can you come to my office today? There was a pause, and she could hear him moving papers, rustling. Today is December 26. I know. I'll make it worth your time, please. Another pause, longer this time, and Ingrid imagined him weighing the request against whatever plans he'd made for the day. Finally, give me the address. I'll be there this afternoon. Corbin Hale arrived at 4 o'clock, a lean man in his 50s with silver streaking through hair that had once been dark brown, kind eyes, obscured by wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a professorial air. He wore a cardigan that had seen better decades and carried a leather satchel worn soft with age. When he shook Ingrid's hand, his grip was firm but gentle, and she felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the familiarity of it. She'd ordered coffee and pastries, set them out on the low table in her office's sitting area, trying to make this feel less like an interrogation and more like a conversation between old acquaintances. But her hands shook slightly as she poured, and Corbin noticed. What's this about, Ingrid? You sounded shaken on the phone. She pulled out her laptop and navigated to a private social media group for Whitmore Holdings employees. Someone had posted a video from the party last night, just a phone recording, but the audio was clear enough. She turned the screen toward Corbin and pressed play. Henry's playing filled her office tinny through laptop speakers, but still unmistakably the same melody that had haunted her through a sleepless night. She watched Corbin's face as he listened, saw recognition flicker across his features, saw his expression shift from curiosity to something more complicated. When the video ended, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand, a gesture she remembered from years ago when he was trying to find the right words for a difficult truth. That's remarkable. His voice came out quiet, heavy with something Ingrid couldn't identify. Is it Starlit Promise Leon's song? Corbin hesitated, and in that hesitation, Ingrid felt the ground beneath her begin to shift again. It's the same melody, yes, but Ingrid, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you 16 years ago, but I didn't because I thought it would hurt you more than help. He set his glasses down on the table and met her eyes directly. Leon didn't finish that song. The words landed like physical blows. What he wrote the opening, the first 8 bars. And they were brilliant, the way everything Leon touched was brilliant. But he got stuck. He couldn't figure out where to take it, how to develop the theme without losing the tenderness of those initial phrases. He was frustrated, kept scrapping versions, starting over. I found him crying over the keyboard one night because he wanted it to be perfect for you, and he couldn't make it work. Ingrid felt the room tilt, her sense of reality fracturing along new lines. That's not possible. He played the whole thing for me that night on the dock. Corbin nodded slowly. He did. But he didn't write all of it. There was another student at camp that summer. Quiet kid, talented but overlooked. Leon asked him for help. The air in the office felt too thin, like altitude had suddenly increased and her lungs couldn't adjust. The other student took Leon's opening and completed it, turned those 8 bars into something extraordinary. The version you heard that night, the version that's playing in this video, that was a collaboration. But Leon presented it as his own composition because he was 17 and in love and wanted to give you something special. Who? Ingrid's voice came out strangled. Who was the other student? Corbin spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. I don't remember his name. It's been so long and he wasn't one of the standout students. He didn't fight for credit when Leon took it. When the accident happened, when Leon died, the boy just disappeared. I tried to find him afterward, thought maybe he'd want to know that Leon's last composition was being remembered. But he'd vanished. Henry Calder. The name escaped Ingrid's lips before she'd consciously decided to speak it. The man in the video. Could it have been him? Corbin looked at the frozen frame on the laptop screen at Henry's face, illuminated by the piano's reading light, concentration etched into the lines around his eyes. I don't know. Maybe. The boy I'm thinking of was younger, obviously, and I barely remember what he looked like. He was one of those students who seemed to fade into the background, who showed up for classes but never drew attention to himself. But if it was him, Ingrid pressed, if Henry Calder was the one who completed Leon's song, why would he be working as a janitor in my building? Why wouldn't he pursue music professionally? Corbin picked up his coffee cup but didn't drink, just held it like he needed something to do with his hands. Talent doesn't guarantee success. You know that? Hundreds of gifted musicians never make it professionally. Maybe he didn't have the right connections or the money for proper training. Maybe life got in the way. He has a daughter, you said. Ingrid nodded, remembering Audrey's small face, those brown eyes so serious as she'd asked to go home. Being a single parent changes everything. Music is a luxury most people can't afford to chase. He might have had to choose between his art and putting food on the table. The explanation made sense, but it didn't satisfy the hunger Ingrid felt for understanding. There was only one way to find out. Ask him. But asking Henry proved more difficult than Ingrid had anticipated. She called his number again that evening, and the next day leaving messages that grew progressively more desperate. This is Ingrid Whitmore. I need to speak with you about the song you played. Please call me back. It's important. He didn't show up for his next shift. The schedule posted in the maintenance office showed him working the day after Christmas and the following 2 days, but each morning his time card remained unpunched. His supervisor, a weathered man named Martinez who'd worked maintenance for 20 years, shrugged when Ingrid inquired. Calder called in sick, said he and his daughter both caught something. Probably from the party. Did he say when he'd be back? Martinez consulted his clipboard. No firm date. He's got sick days saved up, so it's all legitimate. I need his home address. Martinez's expression shifted to something guarded. With respect, Ms. Whitmore, I can't just give out employee personal information. Privacy policy. Ingrid could have pulled rank, could have demanded the information, and threatened his job if he didn't comply. But she recognized the protectiveness in Martinez's stance, the way he'd positioned himself between her authority and one of his workers. So instead, she went to HR and submitted a formal request citing concerns about employee welfare and the need to verify his illness. The address came through 2 days later. A rundown apartment building on the east side, exactly as the file had indicated. Ingrid sent security to check on him, 2 professional men in suits who reported back within hours. The apartment's empty, ma'am. Landlord says Calder and his daughter left 3 days ago. Paid up their rent through the end of the month and cleared out. No forwarding address. Ingrid felt panic claw at her chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. He'd run, disappeared the same way he apparently had 16 years ago after Leon's death. Her questions, her intensity, her desperate need for answers had frightened him off. But why? What was he hiding, or more accurately, what was he protecting? She spent New Year's Eve alone in her office, declining Flynn's invitation to some party, with people she didn't care about claiming work that actually existed but couldn't hold her attention. Every attempt to locate Henry Calder hit dead ends. He'd never had a credit card, paid everything in cash. No social media presence. His phone had been a burner that now went straight to a disconnected message. It was like he'd learned how to disappear, practiced it enough to execute perfectly when necessary. The answer came 2 weeks later, on a night when snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the city in white silence that muffled traffic and made everything feel suspended outside normal time. Ingrid had been working late again, trying to distract herself from the gnawing emptiness that Leon's song, Henry's song, had reopened inside her. The Anderson contract spread across her desk, dense legal language that usually engaged her mind, but now felt like foreign text she couldn't parse. She was about to call her driver when she heard it. Piano music drifting up from the lobby, faint but unmistakable. The melody she'd been hearing in her sleep for 2 weeks, haunting and beautiful and impossible. Ingrid stood so fast her chair rolled backward and hit the credenza. She grabbed her suit jacket from its hanger and took the stairs, her heels clicking on marble, her breath coming too fast. Each floor brought the music closer, louder, until she pushed through the stairwell door into the lobby and froze. The space was empty except for one figure seated at the piano. Henry. His back was to her shoulders, hunched as if bearing an invisible weight that had grown too heavy over the past 2 weeks of running. He played Starlit Promise again, but this time it sounded different. Sadder. More resigned. Like a confession rather than a gift. Ingrid crossed the lobby slowly, giving him time to sense her presence to stop playing if he wanted to retreat again. But he continued through to the end of the piece, his damaged right hand navigating passages that should have been impossible for someone with his injury. When the final notes faded, she spoke, her voice carrying through the empty space. You came back. Henry's hands stilled on the keys. He didn't turn around, and Ingrid stopped several feet away, afraid that moving too close would spook him into running again. I shouldn't have. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much in 2 weeks. But Audrey asked me why we left. Why we had to move to that terrible motel with the broken heater and the smell, and I couldn't give her a good answer. Couldn't explain that I was running from questions I didn't know how to answer. He paused, his fingers ghosting over keys without producing sound. She liked it here. Liked the cookies that nice lady gave her. Liked watching the lights. She asked if she did something wrong, if that's why we had to leave. Something in Ingrid's chest cracked at the image of the little girl with wild curls, thinking she'd caused their displacement. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you, I know. Henry's shoulders rose and fell with a breath that looked painful. I owe you the truth, even if you hate me for it. I could never hate you for playing beautifully. Ingrid moved closer, drawn by the same magnetic pull she'd felt at the Christmas party. But I need to understand that song, Starlit Promise. Leon Merritt was supposed to have written it for me before he died, but Corbin told me Leon didn't finish it. That someone else did. She stopped directly behind the piano bench, now close enough to see the silver threaded through Henry's light brown hair, the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much worry. Close enough to see the scars webbing across his right hand where it rested on the keys. Was it you? Henry finally turned to face her. Up close, the impact of his eyes was even stronger. Gray-green and achingly honest, holding hers without flinching, even though she could see the fear lurking beneath his steady gaze. Yes, the word came out simple, unadorned. It was me. Ingrid's knees nearly buckled. She gripped the edge of the piano to steady herself, the polished wood cool and solid under her fingers. The lobby spun slightly, reality rearranging itself around this new truth. Why? Her voice came out strangled. Why would you do that? Why would you let him take credit because he loved you? Henry said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like his own contribution had been inconsequential. And I was nobody. Just some kid who played because he had to, not because he was destined for greatness like Leon was. I was at that music camp on a scholarship I could barely afford. My family had nothing. I worked nights washing dishes at a diner just to pay for my bus fare there and back. He laughed, but the sound held no humor, just bitter recognition of an old wound. And then I saw you. Ingrid's throat tightened as she waited for him to continue, barely breathing. You probably don't remember. Why would you? I was invisible. But I watched you laugh with Leon. Watch the way your eyes lit up when he played, like he was creating something just for you. Like the music was a language only the two of you spoke. And I thought that's what love looks like. That's what it means to matter to someone. He met her eyes again, and Ingrid saw in them the ghost of that 18-year-old boy, lonely and talented, and convinced he wasn't enough. I wanted to give you something. Even if you never knew, it came from me. Even if you never looked at me the way you looked at him. So when Leon came to me, frustrated because he couldn't finish the piece, I took those 8 bars he'd written, and I poured everything I felt into completing them. Every impossible thing I wanted to say but couldn't. Every dream I knew would never come true. I wrote you a love song through his hands. So you wrote a love song for another man to give to me. Ingrid whispered, tears streaming down her face unchecked. I wrote a love song for you, Henry corrected gently. Leon just delivered it. He knew I had feelings I couldn't express. He wasn't cruel about it. He even offered to tell you the truth to give me credit. But I said no. I told him you were meant for someone like him, someone brilliant and confident and whole, not someone like me. Ingrid sank onto the piano bench beside him, her legs unable to support her weight anymore. And then he died. And then he died. Henry echoed, staring at his scarred hands. And the song became his legacy. I went to the funeral, stood in the back where no one would notice me, and listened to people talk about his genius. Corbin played a recording of some of Leon's earlier work, and everyone wept. I let the song be his because it made you happy, because it gave you something to hold on to when everything else had been taken away. What happened to you? After Ingrid asked, her voice barely audible. Corbin said you were talented, that you had potential. Why are you fixing pipes instead of playing concert halls? Henry held up his right hand, turning it so she could see the scars that webbed across his palm and up his wrist in thick silver lines. The skin pulled tight in places, puckered in others, evidence of trauma that had required extensive reconstruction. 3 years after that summer, I signed a contract with a performance company. Your father's company, actually. Whitmore Productions. It was supposed to be my big break, the thing that would launch me into the career I'd been working towards since childhood. Ingrid felt ice crystallize in her veins. My father's company. The production was ambitious. Big sets, complicated rigging. I was rehearsing one afternoon when something went wrong with the equipment above the stage. A metal beam, heavy as hell, came loose and started falling. There was a girl, a choreographer's assistant, standing right underneath it. She was maybe 19, talking on her phone, completely unaware. His voice had gone flat, distant, like he was reporting events that had happened to someone else. I got my hand caught between the beam and the stage, trying to push her out of the way. By the time they got me free, the bones were crushed. 3 surgeries later, the surgeon told me I'd never play professionally again. The precision required for concert performance, the speed, the endurance, it was all gone. What did my father do? Ingrid already knew the answer, could predict it with the sick certainty of someone who had seen George Whitmore sacrifice people for profit margins countless times. The investigation concluded it was a cost-cutting measure gone wrong. Someone on your father's team had approved substandard equipment to save money on the production budget. The company settled quietly with everyone involved. I got enough to cover my medical bills. Barely. Then the contract was terminated and I was adrift. He smiled without humor, the expression making him look older, more worn. So I learned to fix the things that break. Seemed fitting. I couldn't create beauty anymore, but I could at least make sure other people's lives functioned. And eventually I needed work, any work, because I had a daughter and medical debt and a hand that ached every time the weather changed. Did you know when you took this job here? Ingrid had to ask, even though part of her didn't want to hear the answer. Did you know who I was? Not at first, Henry admitted. I needed the pride too badly to be choosy. But then I saw your name on the building directory, and I wondered. And then I saw you for the first time since that summer, and I knew. He met her eyes, and the rawness in his expression made Ingrid's breath catch. I stayed because I'm a coward, because seeing you from a distance, even if you never knew I existed, was better than not seeing you at all. Word count 10247, continuing to reach minimum of 18,000 words. Before Ingrid could formulate a response, before she could process the magnitude of what Henry had just revealed, the lobby doors burst open with a violence that shattered the intimacy of the moment. Flynn Baker strode in, his face flushed with an anger that made his features ugly, the careful polish he usually maintained stripped away to reveal something petty and cruel beneath. Behind him, two men in suits flanked a third figure that Ingrid recognized immediately with a sinking sensation in her stomach. Her father. George Whitmore carried himself with the same imperious bearing that had defined his 30-year reign as CEO before Ingrid had taken over, forced him into a position where his title was chairman emeritus. But his real power had been carefully, methodically stripped away over years of strategic maneuvering. His silver hair was slicked back with product that caught the lobby lights. His charcoal suit immaculate despite the late hour, but his eyes cold and calculating even at 72, held nothing but contempt as they landed on Henry. So it's true. George's voice dripped with disdain, each word carefully enunciated to maximize impact. My daughter has been sneaking around with the help, Ingrid. I raised you better than this. What are you doing here? Ingrid demanded, standing so fast the piano bench scraped against marble. This is my building. You have no authority here anymore. Flynn called me. George gestured to the younger man with a proprietary air that suggested he still believed he controlled the pieces on this particular board. Said you were making a fool of yourself over some janitor who's trying to extort you with a sob story about an old accident. Said I needed to intervene before you did something that would damage the company's reputation irreparably. Flynn stepped forward, his expression smug despite the anger simmering beneath it. I've been watching you, Ingrid. The late-night calls to this Corbin Hale person, the request to HR for employee files, the security team you sent to an East Side apartment. You think I don't have people keeping me informed? We're supposed to be married in 4 weeks. I have a right to know when my future wife is behaving erratically. You have no rights where I'm concerned. Ingrid's voice came out cold enough to freeze. And you certainly don't have the right to drag my father into situations that are none of his business. George waved a dismissive hand, his attention focused entirely on Henry, who had remained seated at the piano bench, his face carefully neutral, despite the threat radiating from the two older men. I assume this is about the Whitmore Productions incident. George said it casually, like he was discussing weather or stock prices. The one where that nobody pianist tried to sue us for millions because he was too clumsy to avoid falling equipment. He's not trying to extort anyone. Ingrid stepped between her father and Henry, physically placing herself as a barrier. And that accident wasn't his fault. It was ours. Your fault. You approved substandard equipment to cut costs, and it destroyed his career. It was business. George corrected his tone, suggesting he was explaining something obvious to a slow child. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the bottom line. The boy was compensated fairly for his inconvenience. Fairly, Ingrid's voice rose, echoing through the empty lobby. You destroyed his life and paid him barely enough to cover his medical bills. He was supposed to have a career as a concert pianist, and you ruined that to save, what, a few $1,000s on equipment rental. He was mediocre at best. George's gaze slid to Henry with undisguised contempt. We did him a favor, honestly. If he'd actually had real talent, he would have found a way to succeed despite the injury. True artists always do. Instead, he's here cleaning toilets, which is exactly where someone of his caliber belongs. Henry remained silent through this assessment, his jaw tight, his hands clenched in his lap. But Audrey, who had been sleeping in one of the lobby chairs covered by Henry's jacket, woke at the sound of Ray's voices. She stumbled over to her father, rubbing her eyes with small fists, her hair mussed from sleep. "Daddy, what's happening? Why is everyone yelling?" Flynn sneered at the sight of the child, his lip curling. "This is exactly the problem. You're so busy playing house with this man and his brat that you've forgotten what's at stake here, Ingrid. Our wedding is in 4 weeks. The merger of your company with my firm's investment portfolio will create a financial powerhouse that could dominate the Eastern Seaboard market." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to something that might have been intended as reasonable, but came across as threatening. "But if word gets out that you're romantically involved with maintenance staff, with a man who has nothing to offer except damaged hands and someone else's child, we lose everything. Investors will pull out. Your board will question your judgment, the engagement, the merger. All of it collapses. Is that really what you want? To throw away billions for some pathetic fantasy about rescuing a broken musician? Then let it collapse." Ingrid said the words clearly, decisively, and felt something in her chest loosen with the admission. "I don't love you, Flynn. I never did. This engagement was my father's idea, not mine. A strategic alliance that would benefit everyone except the two people actually getting married. I'm done letting him dictate my life." George's face purpled, the color rising from his collar to stain his carefully maintained complexion. "You ungrateful gnome!" Ingrid's voice cut through the lobby like a blade sharp enough to draw blood. "Let's talk about gratitude. Let's talk about how you've spent my entire life sacrificing every meaningful relationship I could have had because they weren't profitable enough for your standards. Let's talk about how you made me believe that love was a weakness and power was the only currency that mattered in this world." She turned to face him fully, years of resentment crystallizing into words she'd never allowed herself to speak before. "And let's definitely talk about how you stood by and watched an innocent man's life fall apart, watched his dreams turn to dust, because saving a few $1,000s on safety equipment was more important than doing the right thing. Because heaven forbid, George Whitmore prioritized human welfare over quarterly profits." Her father's expression hardened into something dangerous. "You're making a mistake. That man," he gestured at Henry with disdain, "is a ghost, a failure who never amounted to anything and never will. He'll drag you down with him, tarnish everything we've built, destroy the legacy I spent 3 decades creating. Maybe." Ingrid felt tears threaten, but refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of these men who would interpret emotion as weakness. "But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. Can you say the same, Father? When you're alone in that enormous house, when the board meetings are over and the deals are closed, and you're left with just yourself, are you proud of what you see?" George Whitmore stared at his daughter for a long moment, something flickering in his eyes that might have been pain or regret if he were capable of such emotions. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silence that had fallen over the lobby. "This isn't over, Ingrid." His voice drifted back to her, a promise and a threat combined. "You'll regret choosing him over family, over everything I taught you to value." Then the doors closed behind him, and he was gone, leaving a void that felt both terrifying and liberating. Flynn lingered his anger, having transformed into something colder, more calculated. "You think you've won something here." His voice was soft, almost conversational, which made the malice beneath it more chilling. "But you have no idea what you've just done. I have documentation of financial irregularities in some of your recent acquisitions. Questionable decisions that could be interpreted as violations of fiduciary duty. I was saving them as insurance, but now I think I'll share them with the SEC, with your board, with every business journalist who might be interested in a story about a CEO whose personal life has compromised her professional judgment. Try." Ingrid met his gaze without flinching. "But do it from a distance, Flynn. You're no longer welcome in my building. Security will escort you out." She pulled out her phone and texted her head of security, a former military woman named Rodriguez, who took her job seriously. Within 2 minutes, Rodriguez appeared with 2 additional officers, and Flynn found himself being professionally but firmly guided toward the exit despite his protests. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers." His voice echoed back as the doors closed behind him, the threat hanging in the air like smoke. Then it was just Ingrid and Henry and Audrey in the vast lobby, the silence settling around them, heavy with everything that had just transpired. Audrey had retreated to her father's lap during the confrontation, her small arms wrapped around his neck, her face buried against his shoulder. Ingrid sank onto the piano bench beside them, suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation draining away to leave her hollow. "I'm sorry, I never meant for any of this to touch you. You have nothing to apologize for." Henry's voice was gentle, one hand rubbing soothing circles on Audrey's back. "That was between you and them. It was about you, about us, about choices I should have made years ago, but was too afraid to attempt." She looked at Audrey's curls so dark against Henry's gray work shirt. "Your daughter, she's going to think I'm the crazy lady who caused trouble." Audrey lifted her head from Henry's shoulder and regarded Ingrid with those serious brown eyes. "Are you sad?" Ingrid managed a watery smile, surprised by the directness of the question. "A little. But sometimes being sad means you're brave enough to choose what's right instead of what's easy." "Daddy's brave too," Audrey declared with the absolute certainty only children possess. "He plays music even though his hand hurts sometimes. I see him rubbing it at night when he thinks I'm asleep." Really, Ingrid looked at Henry, saw confirmation in the way he ducked his head, embarrassed to be caught in this small vulnerability. "It aches," he admitted quietly, "especially when it's cold or when I've been working with my hands all day. But playing helps sometimes, reminds me that even damaged things can still make beauty." Ingrid reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and took his scarred right hand in both of hers. The skin felt different under her fingers, the texture changed by trauma and surgery, but warmth still radiated from his palm. She traced one of the silver lines, gently following it from his wrist to his knuckles. "Play it again," she whispered. "Please, I need to hear it now, knowing the truth, knowing that you wrote it, that every note came from you." Henry hesitated, then shifted Audrey, so she sat beside him on the bench instead of in his lap. The little girl's eyes went wide with delight at being included, at being part of the music instead of just an audience. "Can you play this part?" Henry showed her a simple sequence of notes in the lower register, the foundation of the melody. Audrey's small fingers fumbled at first, striking keys too hard and then too soft, but Henry coached her patiently until she found the rhythm. "Just like that. Keep it steady. I'll add the rest." Then he began to play, his scarred right hand moving with hard-won grace while Audrey provided the heartbeat beneath. The melody rose through the empty lobby, no longer a ghost of the past, but something present and alive, transformed by this new context into a bridge between what was and what might be. Ingrid listened with her eyes closed, and this time, when tears came, she let them fall unchecked. Because now she heard different things in the music. Not Leon's confident passion, but Henry's quiet devotion. Not the promise of a boy certain he'd live forever, but the hope of a man who'd learned that survival itself required courage. The piece had new meaning now, layers she'd never noticed before. The way certain passages seemed to ask questions without demanding answers. The gentleness that never quite gave way to triumph. The resolution that felt like acceptance rather than victory. When the music ended, Audrey beamed with pride at her contribution, and Henry smiled at her with such open affection that Ingrid felt something crack wider in her chest. This was what love looked like when it wasn't performed for audiences or calculated for advantage. Simple and complicated all at once, messy and necessary and real. "I need to tell you something," Ingrid said, her voice steadier now. "If I asked you to give me a chance to let me know you properly, instead of from a distance, would you be brave enough to say yes?" She took a breath, forcing herself to continue. "Even though I come with all this baggage, even though my father will fight us every step of the way, will try to destroy you just to prove he can. Even though the world will call you a gold digger and me a fool. Even though Flynn will make good on his threats and try to tear down everything I've built. Would you still be willing to try?" Henry's gray-green eyes searched hers, and she saw fear there. Uncertainty, the accumulated weight of years spent believing he wasn't enough. But beneath that, something else. Something that looked like hope trying to take root despite hostile soil. "I wrote you a love song 16 years ago." His voice was quiet but steady. "I think I can manage a little courage now." Ingrid laughed, the sound breaking through tears, unexpected and genuine. "Good, because I'm terrified and I could use someone who knows what it's like to start over from nothing." Audrey yawned hugely, interrupting the moment with the perfect timing of exhausted children everywhere. "Can we go home now? I'm really sleepy and my bed is in that place with the broken heater." Henry winced. We're staying at a motel temporarily while I look for a new apartment. The last place I couldn't risk the landlord giving out information about where we'd gone. Come stay at my place. The words were out of Ingrid's mouth before she'd fully thought them through, but once spoken, she didn't want to take them back. I have guest rooms that never get used. It's ridiculous, actually, how much space I have for one person. You and Audrey should stay there at least until you find something permanent. I can't accept. Yes, you can. Ingrid interrupted gently. You can because I'm asking not as your boss, but as someone who wants to know you. As someone who spent 16 years carrying a piece of you without knowing it, and now that I know the truth, I'm not ready to let you disappear again. She stood and held out her hand to Audrey. What do you say? Want to see a penthouse with windows that look out over the whole city? Audrey's eyes lit up despite her exhaustion, and she slipped her small hand into Ingrid's, with a trust that made Ingrid's throat tight. Will there be hot chocolate? I'll make you the best hot chocolate you've ever had. Ingrid promised and found she meant it with an intensity that surprised her. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were real in a way Ingrid's life hadn't been for years. Flynn made good on his threats, leaking carefully edited financial documents to business journalists who ran stories questioning her judgment and leadership. The headlines were brutal CEO's romantic entanglement with maintenance worker raises questions about decision-making. Whitmore Holdings stock dips as investors worry about leadership stability. Her board called an emergency meeting, faces grave, as they suggested perhaps she should take a leave of absence. Let someone else guide the company through this period of uncertainty. Ingrid sat at the head of the conference table in a blood-red power suit and told them exactly where they could file their suggestions. I have never made a business decision based on anything other than what's best for this company. My personal life has zero impact on my ability to run Whitmore Holdings, and if you doubt that, I invite you to review our numbers from the past 5 years. We've tripled in value. We've expanded into new markets. We've outperformed every competitor in our sector. She stood, placing her palms flat on the polished wood surface. So unless someone here can demonstrate actual evidence of compromised judgment, actual proof that my personal relationships have damaged the company, I suggest you remember who transformed this firm from my father's struggling operation into what it is today. And I suggest you ask yourselves whether you really want to bet against me. The room fell silent. Then James Chen, the longest-serving board member and one of the few who'd supported her ascension to CEO, cleared his throat. I move that we issue a statement of confidence in Ms. Whitmore's leadership and make it clear that any attacks on her personal life will be met with legal action for defamation. The motion passed, not unanimously, but by enough votes that the dissenters knew they'd lost this battle. But the real turning point came when Corbin Hale went public with documentation he'd kept for 16 years. Old notebooks from that summer music camp featuring Leon's handwritten composition with notes in the margin identifying the sections he'd written versus the ones completed by another student. Dated photographs showing Leon and Henry working together at a piano, Leon's arm around the younger boy's shoulders in a gesture of collaboration rather than competition. Most powerfully, a letter Leon had written to Corbin 2 weeks before his death, never sent but found among his belongings. In it, Leon expressed guilt about taking credit for the completed version of Starlit Promise, worried that he'd stolen something from a boy who didn't have the confidence to claim his own work. Henry wrote the most beautiful parts. Leon had written in that careful script that Corbin recognized immediately. The sections that make Ingrid cry when she hears them. He says he doesn't mind, says he just wants her to have something special, but it feels wrong. I'm going to tell her the truth when camp ends. She should know who really created the gift I gave her. But camp had ended with Leon's death, and the truth had been buried for 16 years. When Corbin released this documentation to the press, the narrative shifted completely. Instead of a scandal about a CEO having an inappropriate relationship with an employee, it became a story about long-lost love and artistic integrity, about a talented musician whose career had been destroyed by corporate negligence, who'd spent years in poverty rather than fighting for recognition he deserved. The public, always hungry for romance and redemption, latched onto it with enthusiasm. Donations poured into a fund Ingrid established in Leon Merritt's name, designated for scholarships for young musicians from low-income backgrounds. Within weeks, they had enough to fund 20 full scholarships to prestigious music programs. Henry began teaching piano to children at a community center that Ingrid's company sponsored, And twice a week, Audrey attended his classes, her laughter ringing through rooms that had known too much silence. He was patient with his students in a way that suggested he understood what it meant to love music so much it hurt what it took to keep creating even when the world insisted you weren't good enough. George Whitmore fought bitterly to regain control of the company, calling in favors from old allies, attempting to leverage his remaining shares into something resembling power. But the board sided firmly with Ingrid, seeing in her something her father had never possessed: the ability to admit vulnerability without sacrificing strength. They forced George into early retirement with a severance package that was generous enough to avoid a lawsuit, but came with a non-compete clause that effectively ended his influence in the real estate development world. He moved to Florida bitter and isolated, sending Ingrid occasional emails that oscillated between fury and something that might have been regret if he'd been capable of such introspection. Ingrid grieved the father she'd wanted him to be rather than accepting the one he was, and slowly, with Henry's patient presence, she began to heal wounds she hadn't known she was carrying. On a Saturday morning in late January, Ingrid woke to the sound of piano music drifting through her penthouse. She padded out of her bedroom in bare feet and found Henry at the Steinway she'd purchased specifically for him, Audrey curled up on the couch nearby with a book about butterflies. The melody he played was new. Nothing she recognized, but it carried echoes of starlit promise in its DNA. Gentler, though more contemplative, like someone working through questions rather than making grand declarations. "What's this?" She settled on the bench beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Something I've been working on." Henry's fingers continued moving through phrases, testing different resolutions. "I thought maybe it was time to write something that's completely mine. Not finishing someone else's work, but creating from the beginning." "It's beautiful." Ingrid rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of coffee and soap and something uniquely him. "What will you call it?" Henry played a few more bars before answering. "Second movement, because every great piece of music has more than one part. And this is just the beginning." Ingrid lifted her head to look at him, seeing in his profile the boy who'd loved her from a distance and the man who'd learned to make beauty from brokenness. "Promise me something, anything. Promise me we'll keep writing this song together, that no matter what happens, we won't let the music stop." Henry turned to face her, bringing one scarred hand up to cup her cheek with a tenderness that made her eyes burn. "I promise." And this time there were no secrets between them, no shadows of the past standing in the way of what they might build together. Just two people who'd found each other across years and loss and impossible odds, who'd chosen each other, not because it was easy, but because some songs were too important not to sing. Outside the city hummed its morning symphony, traffic and construction sirens and the rush of wind between buildings. But inside the penthouse, in the golden morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, there was only music. The kind that heals, the kind that saves, the kind that proves even the most broken things can be made beautiful again if someone brave enough is willing to try. Audrey looked up from her book and announced she was hungry. Could they make pancakes, the kind with chocolate chips that Ingrid had made last weekend? Henry laughed and stood, offering his hand to Ingrid, who took it without hesitation. They moved into the kitchen together, Audrey chattering about the butterfly life cycle while Henry found the mixing bowl and Ingrid retrieved ingredients from the refrigerator. It was domestic and ordinary, and exactly what Ingrid had been missing without knowing she needed it. This was what her father had never understood, what Flynn had been incapable of recognizing. That power without connection was just isolation wearing expensive clothes. That success measured only in profit margins left you rich, but starving. As Henry flipped pancakes while Audrey carefully counted chocolate chips to add to the batter, Ingrid felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for 16 years. Not the dramatic resolution of a fairy tale, but something better, the quiet certainty that she'd finally found her way home. The first crisis came 3 weeks after Henry and Audrey moved into the penthouse, arriving in the form of a court summons delivered by a process server who waited patiently in the lobby until Henry descended for his morning shift. Ingrid had insisted he didn't need to work maintenance anymore, had offered him a position as the company's cultural liaison or some other invented title that would pay better and carry less stigma, but Henry had refused. "I need to earn my place." He'd told her over coffee one morning, Audrey still asleep in the guest room that had become hers. "If I let you just give me things, everyone will say they were right about me, that I'm using you." The summons alleged that Henry Calder was an unfit parent that his unstable living situation and questionable judgment in pursuing a romantic relationship with his employer demonstrated a pattern of behavior inconsistent with proper child rearing. The petition filed by an entity calling itself the Concerned Citizens for Child Welfare requested an immediate investigation by Child Protective Services and potential temporary removal of Audrey Calder pending a full evaluation of the home environment. Henry's hands shook as he read the document, the legal language swimming before his eyes. Ingrid found him in the lobby 20 minutes later, still standing in the same spot, the papers clutched so tightly they'd begun to crumple. "Let me see." She took the summons gently, her eyes scanning the text with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd reviewed thousands of contracts and legal filings. Her jaw tightened as she reached the signature page. Flynn. This is Flynn's work, even if he's hidden behind this fake organization. "How can he do this?" Henry's voice came out strangled. "Audrey, she's everything to me. They can't just take her." "They won't." Ingrid pulled out her phone, already dialing. "I'm calling Rebecca Torres, the best family law attorney in the state. She owes me a favor from when I helped her sister with a zoning issue. But what if they do? What if some investigator comes and sees that I'm living in my boss's penthouse, that I don't have a real apartment of my own, that I let my daughter get hurt at a work party? What if they decide I'm not good enough?" Ingrid grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Listen to me, you are an incredible father. Audrey is healthy, happy, loved, and thriving. Any investigator who spends 5 minutes with you both will see that. This is intimidation, nothing more. Flynn is trying to scare us into backing down." But the fear in Henry's eyes didn't diminish, and Ingrid realized with a sinking sensation that this wound went deeper than Flynn's current attack. This was the accumulated weight of years spent believing he wasn't enough, that anything good in his life could be snatched away at any moment. Rebecca Torres arrived at the penthouse that evening, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with silver streaking through dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She spent 2 hours interviewing Henry and Audrey, separately reviewing the summons and making notes in a leather portfolio that never left her side. When she finished, she accepted Ingrid's offer of coffee and delivered her assessment with the bluntness Ingrid had always appreciated. "This is a nuisance suit designed to harass and intimidate. There's no legitimate basis for questioning your fitness as a parent, Mr. Calder. Your daughter is well cared for, articulate, clearly bonded to you, and shows no signs of neglect or abuse. The living situation is actually better than what most single parents can provide." "Then why file it?" Henry asked. "To make you afraid, to distract you, to create public spectacle that damages both your reputation and Ms. Whitmore's." Rebecca's expression hardened. "But whoever is behind this made a critical mistake. They underestimated how quickly I can dismantle baseless claims and how aggressively I pursue sanctions against people who abuse the family court system for personal vendettas. Can you make it go away?" Ingrid leaned forward. "I can do better than that. I can make them regret ever filing it." Rebecca's smile held no warmth. "By the time I'm done, Flynn Baker's name will be mud in every family court in this state. The CPS investigation happened anyway because once the process started, it had to run its course regardless of Rebecca's confidence." A caseworker named Maria Sanchez arrived 3 days later, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes who apologized for the intrusion before beginning her assessment. She interviewed Audrey in the guest room, now decorated with posters of butterflies and a bookshelf Henry had assembled from a kit. She inspected the refrigerator, noted the healthy food options, observed the child-proofing measures Ingrid had immediately installed despite the penthouse's usual adult-only occupancy. She asked Henry about his work schedule, childcare arrangements, Audrey's medical history, and school enrollment. Through it all, Henry answered with a calm. He didn't feel hyper-aware that one wrong word could trigger consequences he couldn't control. When Maria finished, she closed her notebook and offered Henry the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Mr. Calder, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen real neglect, real abuse, real situations where children are in danger. This is not one of those situations. Your daughter is loved, safe, and thriving. I'll be recommending immediate dismissal of this petition." Henry's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep being the father you clearly already are." Maria glanced around the penthouse at the piano where sheet music lay scattered at the kitchen, where Audrey's drawings decorated the refrigerator with magnets. "Though I will say not every 7-year-old gets to live somewhere this nice. You're doing something right. After she left, Henry collapsed onto the couch and let himself shake. All the fear he'd been suppressing for days finally released. Ingrid sat beside him and pulled him into her arms, and he buried his face against her shoulder, while Audrey, oblivious to how close they'd come to disaster, practiced her piano scales in the next room. But Flynn's attacks didn't stop with the failed custody challenge. He'd been building a case against Ingrid for months, collecting evidence of what he claimed were financial irregularities and questionable business decisions. 2 weeks after Maria Sanchez filed her report dismissing the child welfare concerns, an article appeared in the Wall Street Journal. The headline was "Devastating Whitmore Holdings CEO Under Investigation for Potential Securities Violations." The story details several land acquisitions Ingrid had made over the past year, suggesting she'd used insider information to secure properties before major development projects were announced publicly. It implied she'd paid inflated prices to sellers who were secretly connected to her, funneling company money to friends and family. None of it was true, but the insinuations were carefully crafted to sound plausible. Stock prices dropped 12% in a single day. The board called another emergency meeting. Ingrid sat at the conference table and methodically dismantled every accusation. The land acquisitions had been based on publicly available zoning change proposals, information anyone could have accessed through city planning documents. The prices paid were consistent with market valuations supported by 3 independent appraisals in each case. The supposed connections to sellers were fabricated relationships that didn't exist outside Flynn's imagination. "I have documentation for every transaction." She distributed folders to each board member, purchase agreements, appraisal zoning records, communications showing the decision-making process. Everything was done by the book with full legal review and board approval at each stage. "This is a coordinated smear campaign by my former fiancé who was retaliating because I ended our engagement." James Chen reviewed his folder carefully before speaking. "These accusations are clearly baseless, but the damage to our stock price is real. Investors are spooked. We need to respond aggressively." "File a defamation suit," another board member suggested. "Go after him for every penny he has." "No," Ingrid shook her head. "That's what he wants. A prolonged legal battle that keeps the story in the news, that makes it look like there's something to hide. Instead, we release all of this documentation to the press, demonstrate conclusively that the accusations are false, and let his credibility collapse under the weight of his own lies." The strategy worked, but not quickly enough to prevent real damage. 2 major investors pulled out of a waterfront development project, citing concerns about leadership stability. A commercial tenant threatened to break their lease, claiming the negative publicity violated the reputation clause in their contract. Ingrid spent 14-hour days putting out fires, reassuring partners, demonstrating that Whitmore Holdings remained strong despite the assault on her character. Through it all, Henry struggled with his own role in the chaos. He'd returned to his maintenance position despite Ingrid's protests, insisting he needed the normalcy of work he understood. But now every employee knew who he was, knew the story of the janitor dating the CEO, and their reactions ranged from supportive curiosity to barely concealed contempt. Someone spray-painted "Gold Digger" on his locker. Anonymous notes appeared in his work area, some crude and sexual, others threatening. Martinez, his supervisor, tried to shield him from the worst of it, but there was only so much he could do. The breaking point came when Henry was called to fix a plumbing issue in the executive suite and found himself face-to-face with 3 junior executives who'd clearly been drinking during their lunch break. One of them, a cocky kid fresh from business school, decided this was an opportunity for entertainment. "So you're the famous Henry Calder?" The kid's voice dripped with mockery. "The guy who's screwing his way to the top. Must be nice, huh? Trade in your mop for a penthouse?" Henry kept his expression neutral, focused on the leaking pipe under the sink. "I'm just here to fix the plumbing." "That's not all you're fixing, though, is it?" Another executive chimed in. "Heard you're pretty good with your hands. Too bad about the scars, though." "Does Ingrid mind? Does she close her eyes and pretend you're someone else?" Henry's jaw tightened, but he continued working, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. "My theory?" The first kid leaned against the counter, deliberately invading Henry's space. "You knocked her up, right? Kid looks about the right age. That's why she's keeping you around. Can't have the CEO's baby daddy cleaning toilets. Audrey isn't Ingrid's daughter." Henry's voice came out flat, dangerous in its control. "And you need to stop talking. Or what? You'll play sad piano at me? The kid laughed, encouraged by his colleagues snickering. Face it, man. You're a charity case. A broken musician she's keeping as a pet project. How long do you think it'll last once she gets bored? Henry stood slowly, the wrench in his hand suddenly feeling very heavy. His damaged right hand ached where he gripped it too tightly, his scars pulling against skin. For a moment, he imagined what it would feel like to swing, to watch the smug expression crumple into fear, to make them understand that broken things could still break others. But Audrey's face flashed in his mind, the way she'd looked at him with such trust when the CPS investigator had asked if her daddy ever got angry. The answer had been no, because Henry had learned long ago that men like him didn't get second chances if they lost control. He set down the wrench carefully and gathered his tools. The pipe's fixed. Try not to break it again. As he left, their laughter followed him down the hall, and something in Henry's chest cracked wider. That night, he told Ingrid he couldn't do it anymore. They stood in her office after hours, the city spread out below them through floor-to-ceiling windows, and he finally admitted the truth he'd been avoiding. Every day I go to work, I'm a reminder of everything they think is wrong with you. I'm the scandal, the distraction, the poor decision that's costing the company money and reputation. Maybe Flynn was right. Maybe this was selfish thinking we could make it work when the cost is so high. Ingrid's eyes flashed with an anger he'd rarely seen directed at him. Don't you dare. Don't you dare let them make you believe you're the problem. Flynn is the problem. My father is the problem. A system that values profit over people is the problem. You are not the problem. But I am, though. Henry gestured at himself at the work shirt with someone else's cruel graffiti still faintly visible, despite his attempts to scrub it clean. Look at me, Ingrid. Really look. I'm a 36-year-old janitor with a damaged hand and a daughter and no prospects beyond what you're giving me out of pity or obligation or whatever this is. Is that what you think this is, pity? Her voice dropped to something dangerous. You think I upended my entire life, destroyed my relationship with my father, tanked my company's stock price because I felt sorry for you? She crossed to him, grabbed his face between her hands, forced him to meet her eyes. I love you, you impossible man. I love you because you wrote me the most beautiful song I've ever heard when you were 18 years old and had nothing to gain from it. I love you because you've spent 16 years making beauty out of brokenness without complaining or demanding recognition. I love you because you're the kind of father every child deserves and the kind of man I didn't know existed. Henry's throat worked emotions too tangled to name, threatening to overwhelm him. But loving me is costing you everything you built. Then it's worth it. Ingrid's thumbs brushed away tears he hadn't realized were falling. Because what I built was impressive but empty. Power without purpose. Success without meaning. You and Audrey, you've given me something real. Something that matters. And I'm not giving that up because some small men with smaller minds can't handle a woman choosing her own happiness. Before Henry could respond, her office door burst open. Patricia appeared, her usually composed expression replaced by something close to panic. Ms. Whitmore, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation in the lobby. It's your father. They took the elevator down to find George Whitmore holding court in the center of the lobby, surrounded by security guards who looked uncertain whether they had authority to remove him. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than Henry made in 6 months, and his silver hair gleamed under the lobby lights like a crown. When he saw Ingrid emerge from the elevator with Henry beside her, his expression twisted into something ugly. There she is. George's voice carried through the marble space, drawing attention from the few employees still working late. My daughter, who's throwing away $1 billion empire for a crippled janitor and his bastard child. Security moved to intervene, but Ingrid held up a hand, stopping them. She crossed the lobby with measured steps, her heels clicking against marble in a rhythm that commanded attention. You need to leave. Her voice was calm, cold, absolutely inflexible. You have no authority here, no right to enter this building. I built this company. George spat the words. I spent 30 years creating something from nothing, and you're destroying it in months because you can't control your hormones. You built a company on the backs of people you considered disposable. Ingrid's voice rose slightly, though she maintained her composure. You cut corners that destroyed careers. You valued profit margins over human lives. You created something impressive and soulless, and yes, I'm changing it. Making it into something that doesn't leave casualties in its wake. George's face purpled. You're weak, just like your mother was weak. She couldn't handle the real world either, couldn't understand that success requires sacrifice. Don't you dare. The words came from Henry, who'd stepped forward despite Ingrid's subtle attempt to keep him back. Don't you dare talk about weakness. You have no idea what real strength looks like. George turned on him with vicious focus. And you do a failed musician who couldn't even keep his own career from falling apart. Who's living off my daughter's charity like a parasite? I know that strength is continuing to create even when your hand is crushed. Henry's voice shook but didn't break. Strength is raising a daughter alone while working 3 jobs. Strength is walking away from bitterness and choosing to make something beautiful anyway. You wouldn't recognize real strength if it played you a symphony. The lobby had gone completely silent, every employee, every security guard watching this confrontation unfold like a car crash they couldn't look away from. George pulled an envelope from his inside jacket pocket and threw it at Ingrid's feet. That's my lawsuit. I'm suing to have you removed as CEO on grounds of gross incompetence and breach of fiduciary duty. And I'm taking this to every business publication that will listen. By the time I'm done, you won't be able to run a lemonade stand, let alone a real estate empire. Then do it. Ingrid didn't even look at the envelope. File your lawsuit, call your journalist friends, burn whatever bridges you think you still have. But do it from somewhere else because you're trespassing. She nodded to Rodriguez, her head of security. Remove him. And if he returns, call the police and have him arrested. George sputtered protests as security escorted him out, his threats echoing through the lobby until the doors closed behind him with a finality that felt like punctuation. The silence that followed was deafening. Ingrid stood in the center of the lobby, her father's lawsuit lying on the marble floor like garbage, and felt something inside her finally break free. She'd spent her entire life seeking his approval, trying to prove she could be the child he wanted. And in this moment, she finally understood that nothing would ever be enough, because the problem wasn't her inadequacy, but his inability to love anything that didn't serve his ambition. She turned to find Henry watching her with an expression that held both concern and something deeper, something that looked like pride. Take me home. She said it quietly, meant only for him, but the vulnerability in her voice was unmistakable. They collected Audrey from Patricia's office, where she'd been coloring, oblivious to the drama unfolding floors below, and rode the elevator up to the penthouse in silence. Only when they were safely inside, door locked behind them, and Audrey tucked into bed with her favorite butterfly book, did Ingrid allow herself to fall apart. Henry held her while she cried, great shaking sobs that seemed to come from someplace deep and old, releasing grief she'd been carrying since childhood. He didn't offer platitudes or try to fix anything, just held her steady while the storm passed. When she finally quieted, her voice came out raw. I'm tired, Henry, so tired of fighting, of justifying every choice, of defending my right to be happy. Then stop. He smoothed her hair back from her face with his scarred hand, the gentleness of the gesture at odds with the damage written on his skin. Stop fighting them and just be happy. Let them rage and threaten and file their lawsuits. None of it matters unless we let it. Ingrid looked up at him, at the man who'd loved her quietly for 16 years, who'd survived his own destruction and learned to create beauty from the wreckage. How did you do it? How did you keep going when everything fell apart? Henry smiled, sad but genuine. I had Audrey. She needed me to be strong, so I learned how. And I had music, even if I couldn't play professionally anymore. Even if all I could do was teach children basic scales at a community center. It was enough because I made it enough. He cupped her face in both hands, scarred and whole together. You have me now, you have us. And we're not going anywhere no matter how hard they push. So stop trying to win their approval and start building the life you actually want. What if I lose everything? The question came out small, vulnerable in a way Ingrid rarely allowed herself to be. Then we'll start over. Henry's eyes held hers, steady and certain. I've done it before. It's terrifying and freeing in equal measure. But you won't be alone this time. Whatever happens, we face it together. Ingrid kissed him, then deep and desperate and full of everything she couldn't say. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his and whispered against his lips, "Promise me we'll get through this. I promise." And this time, there were no secrets between them, no walls built from old wounds and older fears, just two people choosing each other despite every reason the world gave them not to. Outside, the city hummed its evening symphony. George Whitmore was probably already on the phone with his lawyers. Flynn was likely plotting his next attack, and tomorrow would bring new challenges they couldn't yet anticipate. But in the penthouse, with Audrey sleeping peacefully in the next room and Henry's arms solid around her, Ingrid felt something she hadn't experienced in 16 years. Hope. The Wall Street Journal's retraction appeared 6 days after Corbin Hale released his documentation to the press. Buried on page 12, a small column admitting their previous article had relied on unverified sources and failed to properly investigate the accusations against Ingrid Whitmore. They regretted the error. The damage, however, required more aggressive repair than a quiet retraction could provide. Ingrid called a press conference, stood before a room full of journalists with cameras flashing, and methodically dismantled every lie Flynn had constructed. She presented purchase agreements, independent appraisals, zoning records, communications trails that demonstrated transparent decision-making. Behind her on a screen, PowerPoint slides showed quarterly performance metrics that proved Whitmore Holdings had thrived under her leadership, not deteriorated. But the real turning point came when she invited Corbin Hale to the podium. The composer carried with him Leon Merritt's original notebooks, the pages yellowed with age but the handwriting still clear. He projected images of Leon's composition, pointing out where the boy's work ended, and another hand had taken over, completing what Leon couldn't finish alone. "This is the truth about Starlit Promise." Corbin's voice carried the weight of 16 years of silence, finally broken. Leon Merritt was brilliant, but he didn't create this masterpiece in isolation. Henry Calder, a scholarship student from a working-class family, took 8 bars of Leon's melody and transformed them into something transcendent. And when Leon died, Henry let the song become Leon's legacy rather than claiming credit he deserved. Corbin held up the letter Leon had written, but never sent his voice cracking slightly as he read Leon's own words, admitting the collaboration, expressing guilt about taking sole credit planning to tell Ingrid the truth after camp ended. Fate intervened. Corbin lowered the letter, his eyes finding Ingrid in the front row. Leon died and Henry disappeared rather than tarnish a dead boy's memory. For 16 years, he remained silent. He built a life, raised a daughter alone, and continued creating beauty even after corporate negligence destroyed his professional career. That's the man being slandered in your publications. A man of extraordinary integrity who survived more than most of us will ever face. The room erupted with questions, but Corbin held up a hand. "There's one more thing you should know. The accident that ended Henry's performance career. It happened at a Whitmore Productions event. George Whitmore's company cut costs on safety equipment, and when rigging failed, Henry Calder's hand was crushed, saving a young woman's life. The settlement barely covered his medical bills. No recognition of his heroism, no accountability for the negligence." He paused, letting that information settle. So when you write your stories about scandal and impropriety, remember this? Sometimes the real story is about a system that chews up talented people and spits them out when they're no longer profitable. And sometimes it's about two people brave enough to love each other despite that system's best efforts to tear them apart. The press conference changed the narrative overnight. Suddenly, Ingrid wasn't a CEO making poor decisions, but a woman who discovered the truth about a 16-year-old mystery and chosen love over her father's mercenary philosophy. Henry wasn't a gold digger, but a hero and artist who'd suffered injustice and maintained his dignity through poverty and obscurity. Human interest pieces appeared in publications that had previously run hit pieces. A producer from a morning talk show called requesting an interview. Social media, that capricious beast, shifted from mockery to championing their story as evidence that true love existed beyond fairy tales. But George Whitmore wasn't finished. His lawsuit arrived as promised, a 60-page document alleging gross incompetence, breach of fiduciary duty, and claims that Ingrid's relationship with Henry represented a conflict of interest that compromised her judgment. He demanded her immediate removal as CEO and installation of an interim leader, while a full investigation proceeded. The board meeting to address George's lawsuit lasted 7 hours. Ingrid sat at the head of the conference table while her father's lawyers presented their case, twisting her every decision into evidence of incompetence. They claimed the waterfront development had been overpriced, that expanding into the southern markets represented reckless risk-taking, that her handling of the Flynn situation demonstrated emotional instability. James Chen led the defense, methodically destroying each argument with data and documentation. The waterfront development had already appreciated 23% beyond purchase price. The southern expansion had secured contracts worth $200 million in revenue. The stock price dip following Flynn's accusations had recovered fully within 2 weeks of Corbyn's press conference. When the lawyers finished their presentations, Chen addressed George directly, to his tone carrying more than 4 decades of professional disappointment. "I've known you for 30 years, George. Watched you build this company through ruthless efficiency and moral shortcuts. I stayed on the board because I believed the work itself mattered, even if your methods troubled me. But this," he gestured at the lawsuit documents, "this is a father so unable to accept his daughter's autonomy that he's willing to destroy what she's built rather than admit she's surpassed him." Chen looked around the table at the other board members. "Ingrid has transformed this company in ways George never could because she understands something he doesn't, that sustainable success requires more than quarterly profits. It requires integrity. She's built partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. She's created a culture where employees actually want to work here. And yes, she's chosen a personal life that doesn't fit her father's narrow definition of acceptable." He stood, placing both hands flat on the polished wood. "I move that we dismiss this lawsuit as frivolous and without merit. Furthermore, I move that we invoke the morals clause in George Whitmore's retirement agreement based on his pattern of harassment and retaliation against company leadership. He's violated his non-compete, he's attempted to manipulate board decisions for personal gain, and he's created a hostile environment that damages company reputation." The vote wasn't even close. 10-2 in favor of dismissal, with the 2 dissenting votes coming from board members George had installed decades ago, who couldn't quite break their loyalty to the man who'd given them their positions. But even they looked uncomfortable as Chen continued. "Effective immediately, George Whitmore's retirement package is suspended pending investigation into his recent actions. His access to company facilities is revoked. Any further attempts to interfere with company operations will result in legal action for breach of contract and harassment." George rose from his seat slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. "You'll regret this. Every single one of you. When this company collapses under her incompetent leadership, remember that you chose sentiment over sound business judgment." No one responded as security escorted him from the building. The silence that followed his departure felt heavy with significance, the end of an era that had needed ending for far too long. Ingrid remained seated while board members filed out, some stopping to offer quiet words of support, others simply nodding acknowledgement. When the room finally emptied except for Chen, she allowed herself to slump slightly, exhaustion catching up with adrenaline's departure. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate for what he'd done, but Chen waved them off. "Don't thank me, just prove me right. Build something that lasts because it's built on principle, not just profit." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that held decades of wisdom. "And don't let this consume you. Your father spent his whole life building an empire at the expense of everything else. Don't make the same mistake in your effort to be different from him." The words stayed with Ingrid as she returned to the penthouse that evening, finding Henry and Audrey in the kitchen, attempting to bake cookies from a recipe they'd found online. Flour dusted every surface, something had clearly burned earlier, based on the lingering smell, and Audrey's face bore streaks of chocolate that suggested quality control had been enthusiastically implemented. "How did it go?" Henry looked up from the mixing bowl, concern evident despite his attempt at normalcy. "It's over. My father is officially gone." Ingrid shed her suit jacket, loosening the top button of her blouse. "The board voted to suspend his retirement package and ban him from any further involvement with the company." Audrey abandoned her chocolate sampling station to wrap chocolatey arms around Ingrid's waist. "Does that mean the bad man can't be mean to Daddy anymore?" "That's exactly what it means." Ingrid smoothed the girl's wild curls, marveling at how natural this had become, this casual affection with a child who'd entered her life by accident and stayed by choice. That night, after Audrey was asleep and the kitchen had been restored to something approaching cleanliness, Henry found Ingrid standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city below. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into him, accepting the comfort of his solid presence. Chen told me not to make the same mistakes my father made, that I shouldn't build an empire at the expense of everything else. Her voice was quiet, thoughtful. But I don't know how to be different. This is all I've ever known. Then we figure it out together. Henry rested his chin on top of her head. Maybe it starts with deciding what actually matters and building around that instead of sacrificing it for profit margins. What matters to you? She turned in his arms to face him. Henry's gray-green eyes held hers, honest and unflinching. This, you and Audrey, making music even if it's just teaching kids basic scales at a community center. Creating something beautiful that outlasts the making of it. That's what matters. Ingrid kissed him softly, tasting possibility. Then let's build something around that. Something that honors Leon's memory and everything you've survived. Something that proves talent doesn't have to be sacrificed to corporate negligence or poverty or any of the other ways the world tries to break beautiful things. 3 months later, the Leon Merritt Foundation officially launched with an endowment of $5 million from Whitmore Holdings and matching funds from private donors who'd been moved by the story. The foundation provided full scholarships to talented young musicians from low-income backgrounds, covering not just tuition, but instruments, living expenses, and mentorship programs designed to help them navigate an industry that often favored wealth and connections over raw talent. Henry became the foundation's artistic director, a position that let him identify promising students and design curriculum that balanced technical excellence with the kind of emotional depth that made music transcendent. He taught classes twice a week at the community center, working with children who showed up with secondhand instruments and enormous dreams, seeing himself in their hungry determination. Audrey, now 8, attended many of his classes, her own piano skills developing under her father's patient instruction. She'd inherited his ear for music and something of his gentle teaching style, often helping younger students find proper hand position or count out difficult rhythms. Ingrid restructured Whitmore Holdings around principles of sustainable development and ethical labor practices, accepting slightly lower profit margins in exchange for being able to sleep at night. Some investors complained. Others, drawn by the company's growing reputation for integrity, invested specifically because they wanted to support business done differently. The transformation wasn't easy or quick, but it was real. 1 year after the Christmas Eve party where everything had changed, Whitmore Holdings hosted its annual charity concert in the Grand Ballroom, typically reserved for high-level corporate events. But this year, instead of champagne and networking, the space had been converted into a proper concert hall. Rows of chairs faced a raised stage where a Steinway grand piano sat waiting, illuminated by carefully positioned spotlights. Every seat was filled. Employees and their families, foundation donors, music students from the community center, journalists covering the event, and members of the public who'd bought tickets, with all proceeds going to the scholarship fund. The air hummed with anticipation and the particular energy that gathered whenever people assembled to witness something they sensed might be special. Ingrid stood in the wings, her heart in her throat, wearing red again, but this time the dress felt like celebration rather than armor. She watched Henry and Audrey wait backstage, father and daughter, holding hands, both dressed simply but elegantly. Henry wore a black suit that actually fit properly, purchased for this occasion, rather than borrowed or secondhand. Audrey's dress, deep blue with silver accents, had been her choice from a shopping trip that had left Ingrid's credit card smoking, but her heart full. "You ready?" Ingrid asked them, moving closer. Henry smiled, and it transformed his entire face into something young and hopeful, despite the silver threading through his hair and the scars marking his hand. "As ready as I'll ever be to play in front of 500 people for the first time in 12 years. "You've got this, Daddy." Audrey squeezed his hand with the absolute confidence only children possess. "We practiced 1,000,000 times." The lights dimmed in the ballroom. A hush fell over the audience. Corbin Hale walked onto the stage to introduce them, his presence carrying the weight of authority and emotion earned through decades in the music world. 16 years ago, a brilliant young composer named Leon Merritt died in a tragic accident, leaving behind unfinished music and unmeasured potential. But one of his melodies survived, completed by another student whose name was lost to time and circumstance. Tonight, that student plays publicly for the first time in over a decade. Henry Calder, along with his daughter Audrey, will perform an extended version of Starlit Promise, the composition that brought them all here. Corbin's voice caught slightly. "This is more than a concert. It's a reclamation of stolen futures and a promise that talent won't be wasted, that circumstances of birth won't determine who gets to create beauty. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Henry and Audrey Calder. The applause was immediate and thunderous. Henry and Audrey walked onto the stage hand in hand, and when they sat at the piano bench together, Ingrid saw tears streaming down faces in the audience. People already moved before a single note had been played. Henry's fingers found the keys, and the opening phrase of Starlit Promise filled the ballroom. Gentle at first, those 8 bars Leon had written decades ago, the melody that had started everything. But then Henry's contribution began the sections he'd composed at 18 with hands that still worked perfectly, played now by fingers that had been broken and reconstructed, but remembered every note. Audrey joined in, her small hands providing counterpoint in the lower register, the part Henry had written specifically for her. Her playing was technically imperfect, the timing occasionally rushed, but the emotion was pure and true. Father and daughter created music together, their collaboration a living metaphor for legacy and continuation. The piece built through familiar passages before entering new territory. Henry had expanded the composition over the past year, adding a coda that spoke of hope rather than loss of futures, reclaimed rather than mourned. The melody climbed higher, brighter, achieving a resolution that felt earned rather than imposed. When the final notes faded, the silence lasted 3 heartbeats before the ballroom erupted. People rose to their feet, applause washing over the stage like waves. Henry stood, bringing Audrey up with him, and they bowed together while flowers appeared from somewhere. Bouquets handed up to the stage by audience members moved to spontaneous generosity. Ingrid made her way through the wings and onto the stage, unable to stay separated from them any longer. When she reached Henry, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, and the gesture was captured by 100 phone cameras that would make the image trend on social media within the hour. "The melody you wrote saved me twice." She said it quietly, meant only for him, but the microphone on the piano caught her words and carried them through the ballroom. "The first time it gave me a reason to keep going after Leon died. The second time it led me back to you." Henry smiled, and his eyes held everything he felt but couldn't say in front of 500 strangers. "Then I'd say it was worth every note." Audrey tugged on Ingrid's hand, practical, even in this moment of triumph. "Can we get hot chocolate now? The kind with marshmallows." Laughter rippled through the audience at the 7-year-old's priorities, and Ingrid scooped her up, surprised by how natural the motion had become. "Absolutely, the best hot chocolate in the city." They walked off stage together to another wave of applause, a family unit that hadn't existed 18 months ago, but now felt inevitable, like they'd been moving toward this configuration their entire lives and had simply needed time to arrive. Backstage donations poured in from people moved by the performance and the story behind it. By the end of the evening, the foundation had raised an additional $2 million, enough to fund 40 more full scholarships. Months later, on a spring afternoon when cherry blossoms drifted through the city park like snow, Henry and Ingrid sat on a bench while Audrey chased butterflies through grass, still damp from morning rain. Sunlight filtered through branches overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted with every breeze. Ingrid leaned her head on Henry's shoulder, breathing in the scent of fresh air and possibility. "I've been thinking about Starlit Promise, about how it had an ending before, but it feels different now, like it's still being written." Henry laced his fingers through hers, his scarred hand no longer something he tried to hide. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe the best promises aren't the ones we make once and lock away in memory. Maybe they're the ones we keep remaking every day in 1,000 small ways." Ingrid turned to look at him, her ice blue eyes soft in a way they'd never been during her years of building armor against the world. "Then make me a promise, not forever, not some grand declaration. Just promise me today that you'll keep playing, that you'll keep teaching Audrey, that you'll keep showing me what it means to love something, even when it's hard. I promise." Henry said it simply, without flourish, but she heard the commitment beneath the words and knew he meant it. Audrey ran back to them, then breathless and grinning, a cherry blossom petal caught in her dark curls. "Daddy, Miss Ingrid, come see. There's a piano player over there by the fountain, and he's really good. Not as good as you, but still pretty good." Henry laughed and stood, pulling Ingrid to her feet. "Should we go listen?" "Absolutely, but first." Ingrid rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and sure-tasting coffee and promise and the particular sweetness of choosing each other again in this small moment. When they broke apart, Henry's eyes were bright. What was that for? For writing me a song when you didn't have to. For being brave enough to show up even when you were scared. For teaching me that sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones everyone else overlooks. She squeezed his hand. For being you. They walked toward the fountain, Audrey skipping ahead, and Henry thought about how 16 years ago he'd been a scared kid who poured his heart into 8 bars of music, never imagining where those notes would lead. To a life he'd never dared to dream was possible. The pianist by the fountain was young, maybe 19, playing with more enthusiasm than polish, but something pure in his effort that reminded Henry of who he used to be. When the boy finished his song and looked up nervously, expecting criticism from the small crowd that had gathered, Henry clapped. That was beautiful. Keep playing even when it's hard, even when people tell you you're not good enough. Keep playing. The young pianist's face lit up with gratitude, and he nodded vigorously before launching into another piece. Ingrid slipped her arm around Henry's waist as they listened, and Audrey climbed into her lap, the three of them forming a unit that felt permanent, even though nothing in life ever truly was. Above them, cherry blossoms fell like grace. Somewhere in the distance, someone was laughing, and the world felt exactly as it should be. That night, after Audrey had been tucked into bed with her favorite stuffed bear and a goodnight song, Henry returned to the piano in the penthouse. Ingrid sat beside him on the bench, her head resting on his shoulder in the comfortable silence they'd learned to inhabit together. Play me something new. Something that's just ours. Henry's fingers hovered over the keys before beginning. The melody was simple at first, just a conversation between two notes, tentative and searching. But gradually it grew, became a dialogue, became a dance. There were moments of dissonance that resolved into harmony, phrases that stumbled, before finding their rhythm, silences that spoke louder than sound. When he finished, Ingrid was crying. What will you call it? Henry thought for a moment, his scarred hand resting on keys that had carried him through destruction and back to creation. Second movement, because every great piece of music has more than one part. And this is just the beginning. Ingrid kissed him, then deep and slow, and when they finally pulled apart, she whispered against his lips, "Promise me we'll keep writing this song together, that no matter what happens, we won't let the music stop." "I promise." And this time there were no secrets, no shadows, no ghosts standing between them. Just two people who'd found each other across years and loss and impossible odds, who'd chosen each other, not because it was easy, but because some songs were too important not to sing. Outside, the city hummed its evening symphony, but inside the penthouse, in golden lamplight that made everything soft and possible, there was only music. The kind that heals, the kind that saves, the kind that proves even the most broken things can be made beautiful again if someone brave enough is willing to try. Years would pass. Audrey would grow into a young woman who taught piano to children in underserved communities, carrying forward the legacy of generosity her father had modeled. The Leon Merritt Foundation would expand funding, hundreds of scholarships, launching careers that might otherwise have been lost to circumstance. Ingrid and Henry would marry quietly without fanfare or media circus in a small ceremony where Audrey played them down the aisle and Corbin Hale officiated. They would build a life measured not in stock prices or quarterly earnings, but in students taught music, created love, given without calculation of return. And sometimes late at night when the city finally quieted, Henry would sit at the piano and play. Not Starlit Promise, though it remained part of his repertoire, but new compositions that spoke of gratitude and continuation of second chances, and the particular grace of being seen by someone who chose to look closely. The music would drift through the penthouse and out into the night, a reminder that broken things could still create beauty, that love could survive longer than those who first sparked it, and that sometimes the most profound promises were the ones rewritten daily in the small language of showing up, paying attention, and choosing each other again. Always again.